Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Phoenixville Library. If you're itching to get outdoors and you enjoy visiting historic sites, there are 320 reasons why you don't need to venture out of Chester County. We're pleased to welcome tonight local resident and amateur photographer Dave Mossbruger to tell us about some of the Chester County sites that he's visited that are on the National Register of Historic Places. So please, everyone, welcome Dave.
Thank you, Mark. I'm going to try to talk through the mask. If that doesn't work, I'll take it off. As Mark mentioned, there are 320 historic places in Chester County. Hopefully you've gotten to see some of them. There we go, folks. Through the slideshow. We only have time to do a limited number tonight, so I'm going to show you about 20 before all is said and done. So we're treating this as an introduction. This session did come about because I was talking to Mark last fall. I'm going to get rid of this, I'm sorry. I was talking to Mark last fall, and he asked what I'd been doing, and I told him about this project. He said, maybe you could do this as a presentation for the library. So you folks have the luxury of having the only presentation you'll ever see of this. All right, let's see if this works. Hey, it did. So what we're going to try to do is I'm going to tell you where to find the listings, and along with that, get information about them, where to find the places on the listings, and then I've got about 20 specific examples. If we have time, we'll go running through all of those. Finding listings should be pretty obvious to anybody as long as you have a computer, internet access, and a browser. You do something like type in Chester County Historic Places, you get a long list of results. The one I chose for my particular purpose, this photography project, was the Wikipedia site. National Register Historic Places listings in Chester County, Pennsylvania. So if you click on that link, this is the page that comes up. You probably can't read this. This paragraph here tells you they've divided the county up into 3 regions. You can see a little bit better here. There's the northern, the southern, and the eastern. I don't know why they did that. I suspect it's just because of the numbers and trying to get them back down into something more reasonable. If you look at the regions, if you can see these, the total of the places in the 3 regions is 321. And the very simple explanation for that is there's one place called the Middle Pickering Rural Historic District. It overlaps Charlestown Township in the eastern region and east and west Pikeland and the rest. So it gets counted in each region. That's just one place. So we are going to look at the eastern region just for a couple of slides here. And this is an extract that shows the Moses Coach Junior Farm. I can barely see this myself on purpose. In case you don't know, that was for a while the clubhouse for the 9-hole golf course on Pothouse Road where the school facilities are. This is basically a spreadsheet. And what you have in the first column is the name of the place. And I would probably use the word place and listings interchangeably from now on. These are the listings, but each of these is a place. The second column are photographs someone has taken, none of them are mine. Third column tells you when the place was put on the historic register, and it also has a link, and anything you see in blue text is normally a link. I will tell you, as far as I can tell at this point in time, these links don't really go anywhere. Every one I click either comes up with a blank page, or it has something that says this page has yet to be digitized. So I suspect when people have time, money, and enough people to work on it, that'll get filled in later on. Fourth column is a street address and GPS coordinates. If you click the GPS coordinates, it takes you to kind of it's an interesting page, which is probably more complicated than anybody wants. And they have a map on there that's a Wikipedia map. What I will tell you is I was surprised at how many of those GPS coordinates didn't take you to the specific place I was looking for. Sometimes it was the next building, sometimes it was a totally different area altogether. One of them was in the middle of the Brandywine Creek. So for my purposes, for my project, there is a way to use Google Maps to find the place you're looking for. I use these pictures and the street addresses. Once I was pretty confident I had the right place, I just maybe clicked on the road in front of the place. Google Maps will give you the GPS coordinates, and that's what I put into my GPS to find them. And then the fifth column is just a link to the township or townships that the places reside in. They have nothing to do with the register, they take you to the township page. So I'm going to click on the Moses Coates Farm. This is the individual entry detail. You'll have one of these for every listing in the register. Words here is what I would call the Wikipedia high-level summary of why this place is on the historic register. There are cases, and I'll be talking about one later, when this is all the information they will give you. But most of the time, there will be references. And the best references, if you can find them, I would say the second best reference is a Pennsylvania Historic Building Survey form. But the best one, if you can find it, if it's there, is this nomination form for that particular phase. This is the form that someone has submitted to the National Park Service and obviously worked because the place is now on the register. So we're going to click that link for Moses Coates. This is a multi-section form. I picked section 8 because that does give you the significance. Just a couple of comments here. First of all, a place is not historic, let me rephrase that. It's not on the historic register just because it's old. And the second comment is it doesn't necessarily have to be old to be on the historic register. If you notice in the first column, you go all the way from prehistoric to 1900 to whenever. From what I found in my research, I think the facility or place, whatever, has to be at least 50 years old. So you're still in the 20th century for historic register listings. But as I said, it's not just because it's old. You have all these areas of significance. I'm not sure if you can read those, but they're things like architecture, industry, commerce, agriculture, religion, politics, and so on and so forth. So normally you will see both, as you do here, an X in the 1700s for the Moses Coates Farm, and an X in military. And that's because during the activities in Chester County during the Revolutionary War, some of Washington's officers were quartered in that facility. So this is how you find the places, and the best place to find information, in my opinion, about why they're on the register. Where are they? This is a simple breakdown by township. The same comment as before. If you add up the numbers, they probably come out different than these, and that's because places can overlap 2 or more townships. I would like to point out that West Whiteland has 47 places on the register. East Fallowfield has 31. Those two together have nearly 25% of the historic places in Chester County. The next highest number is Westchester Borough with 16. That's just over half of East Fallowfield. Why is that? I don't know. I will tell you, I was trying to take a picture of a bridge. I don't remember which one it is anymore. But I drove to the bridge, and I drove over the bridge, and I drove back over the bridge, and there was nowhere to park anywhere near it. So I finally wound up parking down at the end of the road that I hoped was an okay parking spot. And there was a property on the far side of the bridge that had a building out front with a sign on it that led me to believe that maybe this occupant was sympathetic to my cause. This was the only time during the pandemic that I actually walked up and knocked on somebody's door. And it turned out the gentleman was sympathetic. He let me go back in the side lawn to take a picture of the bridge, and we got to talking a little bit about some of the other buildings that are around him. And I finally said, why aren't they on the register? And he said, well, I don't think anybody wants to pay the fee to get them nominated. So apparently, in addition to being historic and having somebody nominate you, there is some money involved. I tried to find out how much that was, but I didn't succeed. So anyway, that's where they are. We're going to, as I said, we'll try to get in 20 specific examples if time allows. Can anybody guess why we picked this as my first slide? I will tell you my opinion, this is a terrible picture. And I thank you all for being kind enough not to say that. I actually started this project back in 2015. And it took me not very much time, a week or two I suspect, to decide I was going to shelve it. And the reason was, so many of the places are in private hands. And so many of those people apparently don't want people taking pictures of their places. They may be back off the road, but there's trees, there's fences, there's all these things to keep you from taking pictures. So the first time I went to the Stoner Outhouse, which is on Pikeland Road in Charlestown Township, using my handy-dandy GPS coordinates. And I look over here and I see a driveway. I see 3 trees with posted signs on them. And then there's this grassy knoll, which may be artificial or natural, I don't really know which, but it hid this whole complex. couldn't see a thing. And during the pandemic, I was not inclined to walk or drive up the driveway and knock on the door and say, hi, can I take a picture of your house? Well, when looking at, I hope I'm not sounding like this is a commercial for Google Maps, but I did find it quite handy. Pikeland Road goes up and makes a right turn across the bridge where it goes across the creek. And from that point, I could look back and get this picture. So it is not a great picture. It's the best I could do, and it's the type of thing you need to be aware of if you want to chase these things down. The other comment I would make, go when there's no leaves on the trees. Obviously in the summer, you never see that much. Oceanville Historic District, I picked this one on purpose too because I wanted to talk about historic districts. The Stoner Outhouse was a building. The district is an area. And an area will have buildings, sites, and structures, and they'll be further labeled as contributing or non-contributing. Contributing buildings, sites, and structures are those that help define why it's historic. The non-contributing probably came later. So this district, if you go down Route 352 south from Route 30, just above Paoli Pike, you enter the Oceanville Historic District. There's a big mansion on the northeast corner that you may or may not notice. What you probably will notice on the southeast corner is the Friends Meeting House. This whole stretch of road from just above Paoli Pike down to Ridley Creek is what constitutes this district. The area up by Paoli Pike, where the Quaker, there's actually two Quaker meeting houses there, is kind of the spiritual religious center of the village. And down the Boot Road, you're in the commercial center. And this is the old Blacksmith Shop, which was built in 1740. If you stand, this is Route 352, where I took the picture from, the building right behind me was a home, was a post office, was a general store. You can still see the loading dock if you know what you're looking at. If you look right behind this building with your X-ray vision, you will see the oldest building in the Oceanville Historic District. It is a non-contributing building. And the reason is, even though it's the oldest building, it was actually located outside the district, and at some point in time I picked it up and moved it into the district. One thing I found somewhat frustrating, and it wasn't quite so bad here, but the nomination forms, when you find them, very often have references to a map or a drawing that is not online. So they'll say, you know, here's building number 1, number 2, number 3, whatever, but there's no map or anything to show you exactly what you're talking about. So in many cases, I had to guess which ones, or just give up. In this case, we do know this was contributing. I mentioned building sites and structures. The sites, there's 2 of them, are the 2 Quaker cemeteries that go with the 2 Quaker meeting houses. And the structure is that 3-foot stone wall you've probably seen if you've ever driven past this intersection. If I'm going too fast, slow me down, please. Let's come a little bit closer here. White Horse Farm in Schuylkill Township, surprisingly, is on White Horse Road. I never noticed this place until I started looking for it. I suspect some of you probably know about it. But it's well hidden from White Horse, not completely, but if you don't know what you're looking for, there are privacy fences on the north and a big hedge along White Horse. We actually drove into a subdivision that's just south of the farm, and I think Kathy took this picture for me. There's actually 2 reasons why this facility is on the historic register. The original farmhouse, which is what this was, it was a 2-bay, 2-story farmhouse. And from White Horse, it is the closest part of the building to White Horse Road. That was built in 1770. It was later expanded in 1810 and 1840. Still was a farmhouse. What happened was that in the early 20th century, see if I can get this right, in the Schuylkill River Valley, between Valley Forge and Pottstown, there was a trend to buy up these old 18th and 19th century farmhouses and turn them into what were called colonnaded country gentlemen's estates. And that's what you're seeing right here. Addition has the columns. And this was one of, if not the first, of the additions that started this trend in the valley. So there's an architecture aspect. The other aspect is social. The farmhouse was the birthplace and way to the home of Elijah Pennypacker. He lived there during his adult life. He was a staunch abolitionist, and this is one of the many known stops on the Underground Railroad. He let people come into his house.
Is that inhabited today?
I believe so.
Okay.
Yeah, there were cars in there, I think, when you look at it. And the driveways from the development, now you can't drive into it from Whitehorse, as near as I can tell. Crestbrook Farm, Federal Barn, these are in two different township. If you take 252 south from 23, you go through the park, you make that sharp right turn that heads down towards 202. Across the turnpike, the first road that goes into Chesterbrook is Adams Drive. You go a couple blocks and Adams Drive sort of bends off to the left, and that's right where these two buildings are. A little bit complicated. The original farmhouse was built in 1740, that's in the back. The original barn was built in 1792, and that's, I believe, this portion. Then there was a front built onto the farm in 1825, and then there was a second half of the barn put up in the mid-1800s. This went on the register first, 8 years before this. It turns out that during the Valley Forge days, there was a French engineer, and if any of you are French, I apologize for my pronunciation. General Louis du Portai was a French engineer. He was the chief of engineers for the Continental Army. He lived in that house. Amongst other things, what he did was design forts, fortifications, defenses, including the defenses for Valley Forge. In 1903, the manager of the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in Philadelphia bought this property. He did some renovation, and up in the attic, they found the original map that Du Portai used to outline the defenses at Valley Forge. And from what I read, that map is now with the Philadelphia Historic Society. Just as a side note, when they bought that property, they discovered watercress growing in the stream, and that manager apparently picked the watercress or had somebody do it and shipped it back to the hotel, and they used it in the kitchen to put the watercress, is why it became known as Crestbrook Farm. Federal Barn was added, as I said, 8 years later. Part of the justification was to preserve the scene at that area. They're, as I said, they're only 150 feet apart. But it turns out this is thought to be the only signed bank barn in Pennsylvania. Now, this is operated by a nonprofit. It's open to the public Sundays from 1 to 3. When I went to take my pictures, I wasn't trying to get into anything, so I did not get inside, so I can't tell you exactly what the signatures are. I've seen two different versions of what's in there. But I happened to go on the day when they were planning a wedding or reception, and I figured I better take my pictures and get out of the way. Now to Westchester for a second. We all know the internet information there must be true. This is a case where maybe it's not quite the case. This is the William Everhart Building. It was built in 1833. It is thought to be the sole remaining unit of a row-type house. I don't know if that's true. It's kind of federal architecture. The nomination form says Everhart was a Revolutionary War soldier. Another Wikipedia article said, no, that was his father. He was actually a War of 1812 soldier. Whichever, he was also an entrepreneur. He bought a farm kind of on the southwest of where this building is now standing. It's now part of the borough. He built over 100 buildings, became the wealthiest man in Westchester, later became a member of the House of Representatives. But this is known as the Everhart Building, and was well known mostly for the printing concerns it had inside. In 1854, there was a paper started called the Independent Herald. In 1857, they changed the name of it to the Chester County Times. And then in February of 1860, the Chester County Times printed what became the first biography of then candidate Abraham Lincoln. It is considered the article that introduced Lincoln to the general public. I assume that means outside of Illinois, because the reason this happened was there was a gentleman working with Lincoln in Illinois who happened to be a Westchester native. And he put together a manuscript based on Lincoln's notes, shipped it back here, and this is where it was published. I don't know if you can tell, there's a little sign there that says Lincoln Room. And again, I've not been in the building, but I assume they probably have a little museum or something in there. Go down to Exton, or West Pennock Township at least. The listing calls this the Houston Cox House. The write-up says when Clarence Cates bought it in 1904, it became known as the Cates Mansion. It was originally built in 1854 as a country mansion. The write-up says it was top-notch design and construction. I'm guessing it was the central house here. And then when Cates bought the property, he had it altered into what they call English Tudor style, which I assume is all his fancy stuff in the front, and had some addition onto it. And this is another architecture type of listing. This is considered to have introduced the Gothic revival design element into the Great Valley. If you're interested in seeing this, I think you need to be prepared to walk. It's right up Church Farm Road, but you get a certain distance north on Church Farm and it becomes a private road. I saw a road coming in from the east, but I could not figure out how to get to it. I wound up parking at the corner of Ship Road and Oak Valley Road. There's a little non-paved area where maybe 3 or 4 cars can fit. And it's about a mile walk along Oak Valley Road to get here. That's now part of the Exton Park Trail system. And it's worth it. This is an absolutely beautiful property. If you know, go another 500 feet or so, you come to Solitude Farm, which is another listing on the historic record. Sticking in Exton for a minute, these are the Williams Deluxe Cabins. I don't know how well you can see this. This is what they looked like in 2015 when I started this project. Kind of falling apart, roofs coming off that. That's what they look like today. Someone's obviously bought them and renovated them. This is an aerial view. The reason this is on the record was because back in the 18th and 19th century, you had to ship in to support the needs of people who were traveling along what is now Route 30. Well, after they built the Lincoln Highway, you had this big increase in motor traffic. And this is the earliest motor court that was built in Chester County and one of the few remaining in the Delaware Valley. It's expanded a little bit, and we talked earlier about contributing and non-contributing buildings. There were 5, I'll go through them instead of counting. The building right here was originally a gas station. Over on the left side of that was the office. This was the house of the folks that ran the place, and then this row of cabins, which originally were 6 single cabins, I believe. They've since been tied together 2 by 2. That was the motor court. Everything else you see here, like this building, tarot reader, that's all non-contributing. We do have a nice sign now. It's a gateway to Exton. Let's go out west to Alderson for a second. This is one of those frustrating ones. Alderson has 140 contributing buildings, sites, and structures, and there's nothing to tell you which ones are which unless you can read it into the narrative. The argument is that these buildings show the growth in the architecture and development through the period 1750 to 1930. This bank, which is the old Alderson National Bank, is definitely a contributing building. It was built in 1915, and I picked it simply because I like the look of it. So if you want to see more in Alderson, there's plenty to see there if you can figure out which ones you want to look at. Now we're on east on Route 23. Town, everybody familiar with that? I see some nods. Yeah, that's where the St. Peter's Village Road takes off on Route 23. There are 4 stone buildings right in that area, just west of the St. Peter's cutoff. There's a stone barn over here to the west. The actual Nauer house is about roughly halfway between the barn and the mill. This is the mill. And then there's this small house next to the mill. I will tell you frankly, I didn't spend a lot of time trying to take pictures of all of them just because of the geometric layout, and I was afraid someone was going to run me over while I was trying to do these pictures. The Nauers were an interesting family. At the time, they were considered the 2nd highest influence in that part of the French Creek area, second to the Iron Masters. But the Nauers ran this property for 5 generations, almost 200 years. And over time, they became the most influential group. They bought in every home, they owned every home in Nauertown and in St. Peter's Village. And they became the most influential for a very common reason, which you may know already about. The ironmasters who ran the foundries and the furnaces needed charcoal to run their operations. Over time, they chopped down all the trees, then with the source of their charcoal, they went out of business. So as the economy in this area changed from foundries and furnaces to agriculture, guess what? There's a grist mill. So over the time, the Knowers took over. Speaking of the furnaces and the ironmasters, this is Warwick Furnace Farms. I will tell you, if you want to read something really interesting, this is a nomination form that is, it's a little bit long, it's a little bit complex, but it's fascinating. I don't have time to go through it all, so I'm just going to concentrate on the furnace part here. There was a young widow in her 20s, her name was Anna Nutt, N-U-T-T, in case that sounds familiar. Her husband's will, when he died, specified that she and her children would build this furnace, which she did. She married an Englishman named Robert Grace. He was a good friend of someone named Benjamin Franklin. Now, if anybody has seen the two-part Ken Burns documentary on Benjamin Franklin, you know that Franklin felt he shouldn't profit from his inventions. They were to be used for the good of the people. He gave his good friend Robert Grace the design for the Franklin stove. And Warwick Furnace was the first producer of that stove. Although I saw nothing in there that said they gave them away. Apparently kept them in business for quite a few years. During the Revolution, they made armaments, ammunition for the Continental Army. And as it got towards the end of its lifetime, in the Civil War era, this furnace produced the steel that was used in the Union ironclad, the Monitor, of the Monitor and Merrimack. Okay. Closed down in 1867, 1875, it was sold as a farm, but that's not the whole story of the farm. Now, I'm going to get my notes. We're going to deviate just for a second here and talk about some history. This ties into my next slide. I found a document online. It's called They Passed This Way. There's actually, turns out there's several documents called They Passed This Way. If you want to find it, you're looking for They Passed This Way that talks about the Continental Army between Brandywine and Valley Forge. It's not that hard to find, but these dates are all from September of 1777. 9/11, Battle of Brandywine. After the battle, the Continental Army marched 14 miles to Chester, arriving sometime around midnight. And as they said, you can't say one time because the army would be stretched out. It could take hours for them to go on. The next day, after marching 14 miles to Chester, they marched 19 miles to East Falls, crossing the Schuylkill roughly where the Market Street Bridge is now. Apparently there was a bridge there at the time also. They stayed there for a couple of days. Washington decided to go on the offensive, so between the 14th and the 15th, they marched 21 miles to Malvern, crossing the Schuylkill in Manioc, where that, I forgot that, it's not Belmont, what's the other street, Green something?
Green Lane.
Anyway, that's where they crossed the Schuylkill. 9/16, the two armies ran into each other where Immaculata College now stands. And they fought something called the Battle of the Clouds. It was called the Battle of the Clouds because there was a big storm apparently pushed by a hurricane. Some of the people who were quoted in the article said they had never seen rain that bad in their lives. The roads apparently just became totally impassable. The wagons couldn't move. Apparently they just stopped fighting because nobody could see anybody. The article said the Continental Army slid down the hill in the Great Valley and then marched 9 miles to Yellow Springs. The next day, on the 17th, they marched 14 miles up Kimberton Road and out Ridge Road, which is Route 23, and wound up at Reading and Warwick Furnaces. And while they were there was apparently a depot up in Reading, so they got resupply from the depot. The army was in pretty bad shape. They had their weapons repaired, replaced, they picked up more ammunition. And then on the 19th, they marched 10 miles up to the Schuylkill River to cross at Parker's Ford. Which brings us to Parker's Ford. If If you drive up Route 724, you'll miss this completely. You have to take Old Schuylkill Road. This is right below Pigeon Creek. This is one of the cases where I don't know who to believe. The nomination form for this and a website called Here's Where Washington Had His Headquarters as he moved around, both claim that this tavern was his temporary headquarters during this period. There's another article said, no, that's probably not the case, because they did leave, as I said, on the 19th. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he was on the other side of the river. So apparently, unless he came a day early, he probably did not use this as his temporary headquarters. But that's not why it's on the register anyway. It's picked because this is a typical example of an early tavern in the community it served. There were buildings here as early as 1720. Over time, they had cider mills and grist mills and barns and whatnot, and most of it is gone now. What's left is the tavern, which was built in 1867. That's this building here. This house. There's a stables down on this side, but that is currently another residence. And then there are 2 houses across the street. Maybe Washington's headquarters, maybe not. I can't tell you. This was a major stop on the route between Philadelphia and Reading, roughly halfway, especially after they built the Schuylkill Canal. But then somebody built a railroad, and when they did that, this community more or less just faded away. Let's head a little bit south now. The Strickland Roberts Homestead is in West Vincent Township on St. Matthews Road. If you're familiar with the Brendan Cove Preserve on St. Matthews, just go a little bit further, maybe a mile, I haven't really measured it. This will be on the left. This did not have an area of significance checked on the nomination form. I'm going to say it was politics because this was the home of 2 Pennsylvania state legislators, both named Shearer. They know there was a log cabin on the property in 1798, and they know there was a stone building in 1810. Again, I'm guessing that might have been this part, or possibly this part. In 1927, it was bought by someone you probably heard of. It was a Supreme Court Justice named Owen J. Roberts. And in 1929, he expanded this into this complex you see today. And again, you can kind of see, I had to shoot between the trees to get as much as I did here. Paradise Valley, I think this is the one that has a 51-page nomination package. If you're familiar with Quarry Road goes south through Route 30, about where the 30 bypass exit between Exton and Downingtown comes in. The D'Ambrosio car dealership, and the mall has the Wegmans and the Talbots, and maybe it doesn't. Quarry Road goes south. Once you hit Root Road, it turns into Valley Creek Road, and for 3 miles, you're driving through Paradise Valley. And this was on the record because it's a good example of a rural Chester County farming area through the period 1730 to 1940. From a photography perspective, it's another one of those frustrating ones. Being a rural farming area, many of the facilities are ways away from the road. The glimpses of anything to take a picture of are few and far between. This is one of the few I could find, and from the narrative, I knew this was a good contributing building. It's the Edith Floyd Pennock House. Beyond that, it wasn't easy to find. Just west of Westchester, on Strasburg Road, we have the Taylor Coke Historic District. This is one of the earlier settled areas in the county by the Europeans. Again, I hope I'm saying this correctly. Abiah Taylor moved into the township, this area in 1702. In 1724, he built this brick house and this stone barn. The district is generally along Strasburg Road. These 2 facilities happen to be on North Creek Road. If you've been to the Stroud Preserve, heading south from Strasburg, you go right between them. This is considered to be one of the finest examples of English colonial architecture in the county. This is believed to be the oldest barn in the county. And they know know it's 1724 because it has a big stone in it. If you go a little bit further west on Strasburg Road, you cross a bridge, which also happens to be a historic place. And just past that, you come to an area that one time was a little village of Cokesville. The Cokes were apparently sheep farmers originally, but roughly in 1830, they took over this area on the other side of that bridge and they built a foundry. And same story as before, the foundry was in existence for a while and eventually it went out of business because there were no more trees to make charcoal. Probably their most famous output, they produced the Corinthian columns used in the Chester County Courthouse. But if you go there today, there's supposed to be a main house and 2 tenant houses. I will tell you, I didn't even try to take pictures of them because I couldn't tell what I was looking at. I imagine everybody is familiar with the Diamond Rock Schoolhouse, which is the octagonal schoolhouse down on Yellow Springs Road. Lucas Pierce built this octagonal house in 1856. It is the only octagonal house in Chester County and one of the very few in the country. And that's all Wikipedia tells you about it. Now I know everything I know, except if you go to the page for the Lucas Pierce house, there's a section called External Links. One of those links is to a realtor's video, and you can actually see what the inside of the house looks like. Cedarcroft is a national landmark in addition to being on the register. It's associated with a gentleman named Bayard Taylor. I'm sorry to say I had never heard of him. He was a poet, a novelist, a translator, and is considered one of the first great American travel authors. And all that significance of him is why this is on it is designated a national landmark. It is an Italian architecture. At one point in time, it was sold to private hands and was used as a boys' school. One of the boys who lived here was a fellow named Herb Pennock. And it turns out he later became a Major League Baseball player. He's in the Hall of Fame. And I saw something in this morning's Inquirer that makes me think he might have been a general manager of the Phillies at one point in time when Jackie Robinson came into the league. But again, that's not part of the history. The history here is the Bayard Taylor Association. Down in Pennock Township, we have the Heartland Log House, which is the oldest, largest, and best preserved log house in Pennock Township. I don't think there's more than 2 or 3 others. The original house was built in 1715. Now, Harlan melded 2 architectural styles, if you will. I believe he was English. The English built square cabins. He built a 26-foot by 26-foot square cabin. But he used the Swedish design and construction technique, which is these horizontal logs with chinking in between them. And you can't see it here so much, but there's a corner fireplace. There were additions built in 1814, there's a stone addition here, and then behind the bush we can't see it, there's a later addition from 1890, which is stone and frame. But this is another one of those that's really hard to see from the road unless you can figure out how to peek between the trees. It is in private hands. Moses Ross House is on this list just because I like it. It's in Londonderry Township. It was built in 1850. Moses Ross purchased it for $8,000. It apparently has changed almost not at all since it was first built. It was used as a tenant house for 40 continuous years, and yet is still in pristine condition. It's a good example of the architecture style in that part of the county, Brandywine Valley. I will tell you, if you drive up in this area, it's the only thing around. This is Doe Run. You have to cross the bridge to get to the property, but you're in all these fields and woods, and all of a sudden there's this, it's really a magnificent looking building. One of my favorites, the house at Upper Laurel Ironworks. It's one of my favorites because it was one of the harder ones for me to find. This is the one where the GPS coordinates put it in the middle of Brandywine Creek. So there's no nomination form. There is a Pennsylvania survey, and it says this is located on McCorkle's Rock Road in Mill Township. Google Maps says there is no Corporals Road in Newland Township, it's up north from there. So I was looking at Google Maps and I noticed there was a roadway down below the creek that they called Laurel Forge. So I said, that's gotta be the place. I used to try to take these pictures in clusters. I didn't go out and take one at a time. So as I was gonna take this one, I got to the end of the road and I just kept going. The road was narrow, it's unpaved, very much vegetation, all sorts of recycling cans in the mailbox. I'm thinking to myself, is this public or private? So I went back home and eventually I talked myself into checking it out further. Drove up the road and here's the house. Great, this is wonderful. I stopped, I get out of my car and look up and here's a car coming towards me. There's no room to pass. This is a very narrow road. If there was a driveway across the way, it had kind of forks. You could go one way or the other. So I did a little do-si-do to get out of the way. Well, the car followed me around. And I'm thinking to myself, I hope whoever they are, they don't have a shotgun. I better explain myself. So I got out of the car and I started back. Well, to make a long story short, it was just a very lovely lady who wanted to make sure I didn't have car trouble.
Oh.
So we got to talking, and she didn't know about anything about Ironworks. And this Ironworks was almost a century worth of utilization back then. This is the only thing left, basically, that has everything complete. There are some more ruins up at the other end of the road. She thought this had been a chapel, and I can understand why. In fact, it may have been. If you look at the window on the end and the shutters, and if you look at, I'm not sure if you can see them, but if you look at this window, it does look chapel-like. I wasn't sure I had the right facility because I thought that the ruins at the far end of the road could also have been a house based on the description, but when I went back and looked again at the paperwork, they actually got a photograph, and there is no doubt that this is the house at Upper Laurel Ironworks. As an aside, there's also a house at Lower Laurel Ironworks. That's the only place in this expedition of mine where I was actually challenged. I had stopped outside, just pulled down the car window to take a picture. It was warm enough. Some voice came from inside saying, "Can I ask why you're taking a picture?" I just said, "Isn't this house on the historic register?" He said, "Yes." I said, "That's the reason." "Okay." Thank you. This is my last slide, and that's about good timing, I think. I need my paper again. This is probably the farthest place from where we are. This is the bridge across Ross Fording Road. I'm not a bridge engineer, so I need to read this. This is a typical example, but a rare survivor, of a standardized Pratt Pony truss bridge made with Phoenix Cowan compression members. It was built in 1885 by the Phoenix Bridge Company of Phoenixville, Pennsylvania. So it took us a while to get here, but we're back in Phoenixville. That's the end of the presentation. Thank you very much. I'll take questions if you have.
Any questions for Dave?
Yes, ma'am.
The name Stoner Outhouse, didn't Mrs. Stoner Outhouse develop the Charlestown Playhouse, and is that building an old building too?
Yes, actually, I was worried about time, or I would have talked about that a little bit more. Stoner Outhouse was a German architect who came to this country. He became pretty well known. There's actually a low-income development somewhere down around Cokesville that was on the register because he was one of the architects that did that. The property that house was on belonged to his wife's father. And when the father gave it to him, he had an old rambling stone farmhouse. And the reason that property is on the register is because Stoner Outhouse, starting in 1938, converted it into what at the time was called a contemporary farmhouse. So he reused some of the elements, like I think he reused some of the floorboards and stone walls and whatnot. And that's the reason it's on the register. But you're right, his wife Elizabeth was instrumental in the founding of the Charlestown Playhouse, and she is better known there as Miss Betty.
Miss Betty, that's right.
The current owner just redid it a couple years ago.
I'm sorry?
The current owner, named Bob, he just redid the whole house about 10 years ago.
I wouldn't be
Brought it
surprised.
back to what it was before.
From what I can tell, there's no restriction on people who own these places making changes to them. Don't quote me on any of this, I only know what I read. Anybody else? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.